Okay, let's start. Hello, everyone. I'm Anirudh, and a very warm welcome to the Knowledge Transfer Workshop on the future of personal and non-personal data. This session is one of 5 simultaneous workshops being conducted at the Global Technology Summit 2020 under the Knowledge Transfer at Carnegie India initiative. In an ever-changing world, constant advancements and adaptations by the state, corporations, and civil society are leaving behind significant knowledge gaps. These gaps can be filled by understanding the nuances and assessing the impact of such changes on us, the stakeholders. KT at CI aims to build a bridge between those who are at the forefront of these changes and the stakeholders who will be impacted by them. These workshops welcome the participation of not just experts and academics, but also students, government officials, and those with a desire to actively engage with these subjects. In the prevailing virtual environment, we have been able to take this exercise to a global level. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce my co-facilitator for this workshop, Tarunima Prabhakar. Tarunima is a non-resident scholar at Carnegie, India. She works at the intersection of technology, policy, and global development. Her recent work looks at the impact of machine learning and predictive analytics on access to credit and other essential services in India. She also leads Tattle, an open source project she co founded to make accurate information more accessible to mobile first users in India and to increase visibility to trends on chat apps. She was previously a research fellow at the Center for Long Term Cybersecurity at UC Berkeley. In today's session, we aim to unpack some of the dominant developments in data driven technology. More specifically, we will look at the trends in innovation in data related technology and see how policies that regulate data work in relation to such trends. Tarunima and I will present for the first half of today's session. And in case you have any comments or questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box. My colleagues will relay them to us. And we'll keep the second half of the session for answering questions and discussing some of these issues in depth. And we look forward to today's discussion. With this, I invite Tarunima to start.
Great. Thank you so much, Anirudh, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Please let me know when it's visible. Okay. So can everyone see the screen?
Yeah, you can see the screen.
Okay, great. So yes, thanks, Anirudh. I'm excited to be facilitating this along with Anirudh. As Anirudh mentioned, there's a lot of sort of regulation and legislation that is being proposed or is soon to come around personal and non-personal data. At the same time, we have to be cognizant of how the data industry and the data economy is evolving. So in the first half, I'm going to just outline some of the trends around how businesses and data products are evolving, and Anirudh will follow up after that. So when we talk about personal and non-personal data, let's try and unpack what this term data means, right? It's a very fuzzy, complex topic, and as often happens when we deal with something that is new and complex, we fall back on metaphors to describe it. So the economic survey from 2018 and 2019 described data as a public good. So they said data must be treated as a public good in the way that we treat a lake or a park or a library, in that it should be available for anyone who wants to build insights on it, anyone who wants to build products on it. And so generally speaking, it is something that should be available for the general population to use. On the other hand, the Niti Aayog National Strategy on AI quotes Professor Barry Smith and says that data is to AI what food is to humans. And this framing is somewhat orthogonal to the framing of data as a public good, but also in some ways contradictory to that framing. Because when we say that it is food, we're saying that it is essential for something to exist, right? We're saying that food is also one of those things that if one person has access to food, another person does not have access to food. Food can also be scarce. So when we use a metaphor like food, we're attributing all these different sort of features to data, which do not belong to something like a public good. the most common metaphor that's been used is to say that data is like oil. This is from The Economist in 2017. And the reason why we continuously compare data to oil is because it is such a sort of integral, visibly, we're all using products like Google, Facebook, as this image shows, Uber. And when we're using all of this, we are sort of trading and giving away some of our data, and in lieu of it getting services, but also that these companies are getting very rich. So it is natural to sort of look at the newer sort of businesses and say that, well, what is driving them is data, and so the scarce resource or the precious resource is now data. In general, there are many perspectives on the purpose, the value and the risks of data collection. If you talk to, let's say, a lawyer, a legal analyst or a lawyer would be more interested in the rights of the individual from whom this data is being collected, right? They might be interested in the copyright provisions, and that is one perspective on it. If you look at, if you talk to an economist or a business professional, they are more interested in understanding just what the relation of data to the value of business is, right? So how much of a, let's say, a business's success, or even to an extent a country's or an industry's success, comes from data as opposed to some of the other attributes that are needed for, for say, AI. If you talk to a computer scientist who works and builds models, for them data is an input that they need to clean and they need for their technologies. If you talk to a philosopher, data, they're going to look at how data is changing the relationship between society itself, or just changing what it means to be an individual today. So to say that there are many perspectives, and it doesn't become sort of less complicated because of that. But one thing that broadly everyone is seeing is that there is something like the rise of a data economy, right? We are living in a world where we are seeing a lot more data-driven products. IBM, this is a strategy document from IBM, which is saying that how they can look at the data from miniaturized devices, so the Internet of Things, miniaturized devices that are either in our homes or in our cars or in our environment, and how you can monetize the sort of minute-by-minute data that comes from these devices. Increasingly, 25 of the largest tech companies now constitute 20% of the market cap in the US, which is significant considering that most of these companies have come about only in the last 20 years, right? So again, there is obviously, you were looking at all these trends, and the one thing that seems to be most visible is to say that yes, a lot of these companies are collecting data. We can actually see that, and so there is a lot of anxiety and sort of emphasis on data in all of these companies. But let's unpack what it takes to make a data product, or so a data product would be, let's say, one data product that a big data firm is developing. So if you want to take an example of Google or Amazon, right? So there are broadly these 5 steps. And as this graph is showing, so data collection is only one aspect of it, right? After the data is collected, you need facilities to store that data. You need people to make sense of it. So you need people either to label it, to clean it, and so there's the data preparation aspect. And then there is a lot of innovation in actually training algorithms. So fitting that data into some sort of an engine in which that data gets processed. And then finally, there is a deployment, because there's a social context in which all these systems are deployed. So there is this sort of broader value chain, even though we sort of say it's a data firm. There's a lot more that happens than just, say, data collection. And if you think about this value chain, we realize that this value chain is actually distributed across the world, right? So data collection, of course, can happen anywhere, but countries that are more populous are obviously sought after by global giants, because they can get more data from those places. But also that it is again very sort of context dependent, because if you were developing, say, a self-driving car, you would need data from a place where, one, that the traffic rules are sort of conducive, or at least what you're looking for when you're designing a self-driving car, right? And also, if I'm designing for highways where the speed limit is, I guess, 80 miles an hour, it doesn't help me to look at data from a place where the speed limit is like 60 kilometers an hour, right? So data collection obviously can happen anywhere, but also context specific. Data storage is, a lot of it is in colder places, because the temperature goes down, so the cost of hosting this data and storing this data comes down, because data storage is, heats up the servers of, and so you actually, colder temperature helps keep. Data preparation is, you have these annotation farms. So people who will look at that data and then maybe label it and say that, this is a, for example, if you were doing face recognition, they would say this is an eye, this is a, this is a ear. Like, so people who have to be able to work with and work with data. And a lot of this is actually people who have some sort of familiarity and dexterity with computers, right? And so a lot of that has landed up being in India and Southeast Asia. And then we look at algorithm training. That's in some ways a fairly, I would say, like the high skill aspect of this entire value chain. So this is where, when you talk about the labor, it comes down to who has the resources and the knowledge. So a lot of these are graduate students, and just based off the number of researchers and the number of papers, US and China dominate, the innovation and the labor side of algorithm training. And in terms of hardware, because we have to realize at the end of it, all this data sits somewhere. It has to be processed by something, and that is hardware. And on that hardware, as data sort of becomes more, so as voluminous, but also as like the algorithms become more specialized, you actually need specialized hardware, and a lot of that is coming from Taiwan and Korea. And then deployment, of course, can happen anywhere, but we're seeing a lot of it in US, China, India, Kenya. So just to sort of step back and think that, okay, in this value chain, how important is data, right? Like, does better data actually lead to greater returns? So whether it's greater accuracy, but also indirectly then more money to these businesses. What we're seeing is that the traditional sort of machine learning approaches, the kind of approaches that would have been used to build your search algorithm, your search feed in the past, so those sort of approaches actually hit a diminishing return with more data. So that's the green curve, right? And a lot of those algorithms, you actually don't, after a point, it doesn't help you to collect a lot more data, because your accuracy doesn't increase, your models don't do better. But the more sort of the more I would say fantastic developments, the more recent fantastic developments of, let's say, whether it is your voice assistant systems, whether it is facial recognition systems, those use a technology called neural nets. And with those, we have not seen, a sort of a plateauing. So with those, the more data you feed to it, you actually were seeing that those models are doing better. So with this, it would seem that, okay, well, maybe then that's why we need more and more data, so that like businesses keep doing better. But there are interesting trends that are evolving as a consequence. So the trend is that even with like the neural networks that I described earlier, that data is not necessarily coming from people or from the physical environment, right? This is from 2016. This is, AlphaGo is a sort of very culturally relevant game in East Asia. And it was always supposed to be one of the hardest games, and people thought that machines would never be able to play it. But AlphaGo did beat the world leader in 2016. And it was the sort of highest version of this game was designed with one AlphaGo machine playing with another AlphaGo machine, and both of them learning from each other, right? So this was not designed using it. In the later versions, was not designed using data from people or players. This is another interesting trend. I'll post the link in the chat for people who want to see it. So this was, this is from 2 years back. It's a Rubik's Cube. It's a robotic arm that solves a Rubik's Cube. But again, the way this model, learned how to solve this cube was by literally just looking at simulation. So people fed it simulation on a computer of how to solve a cube, right? And again, this was a place where the data was simulated data. The last trend, and this is actually in some ways the most interesting trend, is that even as neural networks, need more and more data, many entities, it's very expensive to train it. So you need a lot of specialized hardware to work with this volume of data, and that hardware is very expensive. So most time, like small startups or most businesses are no longer in a place where they can actually train these models themselves. So what is happening is that you have a few entities that train this model. So you have Google, you have OpenAI, you have the Indian government, right? They are taking all this data, ingesting and building a model, and then they just open, they open like an API. So they open a window into it, and you can sort of speak to their model and build systems on top of it, right? And in some ways, it isn't reasonable to expect that a lot of smaller entities will have the resources, because of course finally startups are known to be scrappy and work on limited resources. So they're not going to have the resources to like set up a whole server farm and train machine learning models. So in a lot of ways, the future of AI could be, or the future of data products could be, less data and not more data. Or at least when I say less data, it could be less in the context of that generated by our physical environments and that collected from people. And with that, I am going to pass this on back to Anirudh, to carry it from here.
Anirudh, you're on mute.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Tarunima. That was really great. What I'm going to do is to basically take off from where Tarunima left off and talk about how a lot of these technologies basically interact with data policy or data regulation. And as Tarunima outlined, we are seeing a lot of developments in or continuous innovation in how data is being used, how firms and businesses are thinking about processing data, and how this is being increasingly developed to develop new kind of technologies. And what I'm going to do is to try and push the envelope in trying to say that data policy needs to be equally nimble in thinking about innovation in the world of data. What we've seen in the last few years in India especially, but also around the world, is we've seen a lot of comprehensive privacy related legislation that basically aim to protect user privacy and consumer privacy. And in India, we've had this personal data protection bill that is going to be the first comprehensive law on user privacy and protecting data. And earlier this year, we've also had a draft report by a committee that's been looking at non-personal data. And the emphasis for both of them has been to look at how data can be exploited to provide an engine for or a vehicle for economic growth and innovation in India, but also to look at how the misuse of data can be prevented and how consumer data can be better protected. So what I'm going to do right now is to basically try and argue that we need to be a lot more nimble in how we think about a lot of these objectives. And I just want to start off with a simple economic idea about general and partial equilibrium. And my uh, my idea is basically that when policymakers think about policies related to innovation and data, they often think about it from the perspective of a partial equilibrium, where they're only looking at issues in one sector, but they're not looking at how their actions or innovations are actually going to change the market, are actually going to influence innovation going forward itself. So when we talk about partial equilibrium, we basically consider conditions or situations in one market, and we take everything else as external to that market. We assume that all of that is constant, and we look at the behavior of people in that market, uh,
as uninfluenced by a lot of those external factors. And those external factors could be user preferences or technological change and so on. But what happens in the real world is that everything is changing dynamically. People are responding to changes in the market and technology and so on. So, and this is something that needs to be considered much more carefully when you are regulating something like data, which is fairly critical for innovation. So in data, where have we been looking at the issues, or how have we been looking at the issues in data protection and privacy for the last few years? What we've seen is that we've had a lot of large data companies that collect large volumes of data, e-commerce companies or companies like Google, Facebook, social media companies, and others that collect large volumes of data. And this is basically a lot of centralized processing of personal data. They're collecting data constantly, and they're trying to use it to derive insights about user behavior so that they can provide better services, but also monetize a lot of it, right? And one part of this is giving rise to concerns about the risks that emanate from this kind of data collection and data processing, which includes things like privacy. It includes things like preventing the abuse of market power. You don't want giant tech companies to actually abuse their power in the market. And it's also giving rise to other related issues like how do you get access to data that is stored in another. If a Facebook or an Amazon collects Indian data and stores it in a country outside India, how do you get access to that kind of data? It's also giving rise to issues like the security or the ownership of data. So how do you actually prevent increasing hacks or attacks on systems that are collecting large volumes of data? We've also been seeing increasing cases of identity theft and other kinds of data related theft that have increased as people have become more and more digitized. So a lot of these are actually premised on the existing business model, which we, as Tarunima is also saying, is actually changing slowly, right? And what I'm going to try and say is that a lot of this actually discounts different possibilities that innovation or that changes in the market can actually bring about. So, for example, we have two or three innovations that are happening rapidly in the market. One of them is something called edge computing, which is basically a move towards doing increasing data processing and computation on devices that are close to the user. So you don't upload all the data to the cloud or to remote data servers, but more and more data is processed on your phone or on your uh, uh, handheld device or your laptop or your tablet, or even things like the Internet of Things, right? Devices that actually compute information uh, within the device itself rather than uploading all of that information to the cloud. So this is something that is different from what has been occurring over the last few years, where a lot of this information actually gets transmitted to the cloud and then is analyzed or processed centrally. The other part is the other technological change is synthetic data or using processed data, simulated data. Again, Tarunima gave a couple of really good examples where computers are learning more and more from data that is not really dependent on personal data. Right? So they are able to actually create data sets that are training other computers or that are training machines without the use or input of direct human data. So human data is used to create data sets which actually go as inputs into training machines. Right? So the dependence on raw personal data is decreasing. And this is not something that is occurred completely or has transitioned or the transition hasn't completed right now, but it's definitely a trend that is increasing in the market and could become much more of a norm going forward. So this could possibly mean that we will have less centralized data storage. Data could be stored in a very decentralized form. It could be stored by the same company, but in different devices that users are using in their own houses rather than on cloud systems and remote data servers, right? This could also mean that the quantum of raw data that moves, or that quantum of personal data that is moving throughout the internet or through the systems, actually reduces, and companies actually store a lot more processed or synthesized data rather than raw personal data. So the future of data could actually be different from what a lot of data policy right now is trying to envision. So you could have a lot more decentralized data processing, right? Uh, you could also have less movement of personal data. And again, none of this is a given, but there are trends that are indicating that some of this could actually happen. We would probably have more personal data that are stored on local devices that are basically part of the entire Internet of Technology, Internet of Things system. And data could also become less important for startups because, again, the example Tarunima was giving, they could actually access platforms that are provided by companies to use the data that has actually been collected by someone else. So their own incentive to collect data reduces if more and more platforms like this become available, right? On the other hand, it could also mean that personal data processing becomes more concentrated, that few companies actually compute or use a lot more personal data than before and provide that as a service to startups and other firms. So you actually have AI as a service, right? It could also mean that some things that are not currently in the market could come up, new markets could come up, or new services could come up. So we have something called privacy as a service, which is uh, basically providing privacy protections as a service in itself, right? And this could actually become much more important and much more vibrant and much more diversified if data storage becomes much more decentralized and much more close to the consumer, right? It could become much more retail in that sense. So the way the market would look maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now, could be somewhat different from how policymakers are currently envisioning it. And this, I'm not saying that this would be the new normal, or that it would completely upend the way markets work, but this could also coexist with what is already existing. So you could have continued collection of personal data for deriving insights and so on, and like Tarunima mentioned, it will continue. There will be cloud storage for a lot of processed synthetic data, but also for some amount of personal data. And this could also coexist with the dominance of major social media platforms, e-commerce platforms as they exist today. But this is not to say that the market will look exactly the way it is looking today. So just to summarize, the future of data is not going to be static. It's not going to be something that is going to be looking exactly the way it looks today. And this will be influenced by a variety of factors. One big factor is, of course, going to be regulatory requirements. We've been talking a lot more about privacy regulation, data regulation in the last 5 to 10 years. And regulations around the world have come up that require data to be stored and collected and processed in a certain way. And this has also acted as a push for companies to innovate on better ways or easier ways of collecting data and using data. So things like requirements like privacy by design that require companies to think about privacy as a fundamental part of their own business model. Requirements that impose obligations on companies to take prior consent from consumers before taking data. That also has a implication on how companies think about taking consent when they're collecting such vast amounts of data and when consumers are online so much of the time. Similarly, purpose limitations, when companies are asked to keep data only insofar as it is useful for them, and to require them to tell consumers that we'll only use data for certain specific purposes. These all affect the way data is thought about by companies, how they think in terms of innovation and so on. And again, it will be influenced by innovation. So we've seen recently that there have been fairly significant increases in computing power in chips or devices used by major manufacturers. Apple has come up with a new set of devices that have far more computing power than before, right? And this is again going to mean something significantly new for app developers, for people who are going to be thinking about how to interact with consumers using Apple devices and so on. And it's going to lead to a new set of innovations. And of course, a lot of this will also create efficiencies in how you think and how businesses actually collect data, store data, and process data. So the future of data is not going to be something that's going to be static in a way a lot of policymakers envision it. So let's look at how the Personal Data Protection Bill actually uh, relates to a lot of this. So this bill was introduced in Parliament in 2019. It came after Justice Sri Krishna's committee proposed a draft law in 2018, which went through a series of consultations, and this bill is now before Parliament. It is being considered by a joint parliamentary committee. Right? And a lot of the basic premise of the bill is basically that firms collect data extensively and they have centralized storage systems. So they collect data from you and they keep it with them, right? And they keep it with them in data centers or on cloud servers. And because they collect such vast amounts of data, it is important to think about user privacy and to impose obligations on these companies uh, depending on how they collect data, how they use this data, and so on. So this bill therefore regulates the collection and use of personal data. It says that you cannot collect data without prior consent. You have to give a notice which says what are the kinds of data I'm going to collect from you, what purposes will this data be used for. It also says that this data has to be removed or deleted after that purpose has been satisfied, and it cannot be stored after that. And it gives consumers certain rights. It gives them rights to access that data at any point of time. So you can actually request Facebook to give you access to whatever data they've collected from you. It gives you rights to have the data corrected. So if somebody has collected incorrect data from you, they have the right to have it corrected. It gives you the right to portability. So you can take your data from one company to another and give it to them. And it also gives a right to be forgotten to consumers. So you can actually request companies to delete certain data that they have about you with them. And it also imposes certain requirements on companies themselves, mostly with regard to how they store data. So there are things like data localization. So the bill proposes that at least some kinds of data collected by companies cannot be taken outside India. So what they call sensitive data and critical personal data has to be kept within India. And one motivation for that is that user privacy should not be compromised. And the other is that if law enforcement agencies want access to that data, they should be able to get it fairly easily. And in addition to that, there are all sorts of other requirements like transparency requirements, privacy by design, security requirements, and so on. So this is the broad framework of the bill, and it imposes penalties for not complying with a lot of this. But what we've seen in how innovation is occurring in the sector, in the technology sector, is that we are seeing more and more use cases where personal data is less useful, or there are different ways of using personal data, right? So we are also seeing the development of innovations that process data at the edge rather than in cloud storage, in cloud servers or centralized servers. So personal data will continue to remain important, but innovations can also help develop alternatives, right? And one important thing to consider is that data protection policy itself drives the direction of this innovation to some extent, right? It's very hard to make a absolute claim of causality that this is the direct cause of why particular innovations are happening. But companies do think about how they will comply with data protection requirements and then innovate. So the law, policy, and technology there is a constant feedback loop that is occurring. And if policy doesn't actually use that feedback loop to keep reinventing themselves, then sometimes that can be harmful for innovation itself. So the last part of my talk, I'm just going to spend a bit of time thinking about what could a future with different ways of processing and using personal data mean for how we think about data protection policy and data protection laws. So there are 3 or 4 ways I'm speculating that that these changes could occur. One is that firms may increasingly store less personal data and with themselves and leave it on the user's devices or their computers and their laptops, and store more processed and non-personal data. So they'll store the insights or the data sets that will allow them to derive insights. Right? And this has implications for how some of those consumer rights that I just talked about can be enforced. It can also make a lot of data storage obligations less relevant, and I'll talk about that in detail in a minute. The other could be that personal data may be stored because it's stored more on edge devices than centralized servers. Issues like data access and localization might become less relevant. And therefore, we need to think about whether such requirements should actually be there or to what extent they'll be useful 5 years from now or 10 years from now. So when we talk about consumer rights, and I said they'll become slightly easier to enforce, that's because data will be stored closer to the consumer. So the consumer, at least hypothetically, has more control over the data. Right? And personal data could also become less important for some business insights if innovation is allowing you to take advantage of synthetic data more and more, or to train machines on the basis of data that was not generated from humans, right? Then personal data could become less important for business insights. And therefore, the whole idea that consumers should have rights and these rights are very important could actually become less important depending on how technology plays out. Similarly, when we talk about data storage obligations, there could be a change in emphasis on what is important about data storage. Right? So if more data is stored in processed form by companies, then obviously the security of personal data becomes less important when firms are storing it in centralized servers and remote servers. Right? On the other hand, the security of data on edge devices and on consumer devices becomes more important because more and more personal data is stored with the consumer or close to the consumer. So this could actually increase the accountability for companies or for device manufacturers much more than firms who are storing data remotely. And similarly, on data access and localization, and what is the basic problem governments are trying to solve? The problem is that firms collect data in one country or jurisdiction and then store the data in another country or jurisdiction. And this obviously creates problems when the police or other law enforcement agencies are trying to access this data. Because now that data is in another country, it's governed by the laws of another country. And if you want access to that data, you have to request access to that data from the government of that country, right? So you can't directly ask the same company because the data is in another jurisdiction. And therefore, law enforcement authorities demand that Indian data should be stored in India, for example. Now, if the innovation trend in innovation works out the way we are currently seeing it, it could very well happen that companies like Amazon do a cost benefit analysis and say that, collecting so much personal data and then moving it out of India and storing it remotely is not worth the hassle. It might just be easier to leave a lot more personal data on the devices that consumers use and only move processed data or the insights. And that would in turn make the whole issue of data localization less relevant because data then would be stored within the country, right? It would be stored in the device that the consumer is actually using it. And therefore, if you think about localization and if you today think about localization as something very critical to how law enforcement agencies must access data, you could make a case that, look, in the next 5 to 10 years, the direction in which technology is changing and innovation is happening, a lot of this could actually become less relevant as a policy issue. There could also be other changes. So Indian companies are starting to invest heavily in data centers, because the idea is that, again, if you store data within India, it's not just going to solve a jurisdictional issue. It's also going to increase the efficiency of processing data, because latency reduces. And in addition, if you create data centers in other countries, studies have found that they actually lead to substantial revenue gains for local governments, and also create a ecosystem where technology can actually thrive. So there are fiscal benefits for governments and also indirect benefits for governments. Now the question is, if data storage or remote data storage becomes less and less important to how companies work and innovate, how does that impact this entire economy of data centers or this business of data centers? And therefore, how should we think about the benefits for the economy from data centers, right? What policies should be adopted? Similarly, we've had a recent debate on the sharing of non-personal data, and non-personal data is different from personal data because it's not related to individuals per se. It's been anonymized, or it's about information that is not relating to individuals itself. And there's been a debate on whether companies, large tech companies especially, should be mandated to share some of this data. And again, it's premised on the idea that the raw data, or the data that these companies collect, has intrinsic value in itself. And this is something that could again change if innovations actually occur to impact this discussion or the nature of this discussion. Another change that could occur is something I alluded to earlier, which is the whole idea of privacy as a service could become much more relevant. Consumers might seek solutions on their own to how their data is stored, how it is shared, what kind of privacy systems or mechanisms they want to adopt. And there's already some indication that consumers are starting to worry more and more about privacy. And a lot of this is also being driven by the whole debate on privacy, by privacy regulation around the world. And it might occur that consumers actually take charge of how they think about their privacy, rather than relying on consent mechanisms that websites or companies offer to them. So again, consumer behavior can then affect how innovations happen and how market behavior changes. So just to summarize what I've been talking about, data policy is basically a policy that impacts innovation, and it's related intrinsically to how innovation takes place in the economy. And policy changes do lead to innovation, but the reverse should also occur equally smoothly, which is policymakers should also be looking at how innovation is going to impact their policies itself, which parts of data policies actually make innovation harder, or which policies become less relevant to the market and only impose consumer compliance costs on consumers. So if this feedback loop doesn't work well, it can actually make policies less relevant and have a negative consequence. So innovation policy should actually account for behavioral changes much more than maybe policies in other sectors, because innovation by its very nature is dynamic. And policies that are based on very specific business models or a very specific view of the world can become redundant quickly, because everyone is adapting very quickly to changes in the market. And that's the basic insight of general equilibrium versus partial equilibrium, right? So if we make policies based on the idea that centralized data storage and centralized data processing is going to be the norm for the next 30, 40 years, it might actually become fairly redundant very quickly. And the consequence of that could be that we unintendedly impose costs at the lower end of the market for startups or for firms that are just starting up, because it's always firms that are well funded that have enough bandwidth to invest in innovation, and then they get even more of a head start than smaller firms. And this is especially relevant for developing countries that are, playing catch up in a lot of these sectors. So countries like India need to think much harder about these issues. So I'll end here, and I thought I would just flag some issues for discussion. And of course, all of you are welcome to raise your own questions. And I thought these are the 3 or 4 questions or topics we could use to take this discussion further, which is, do you think there are innovations that are actually going to challenge the whole rationale or the efficacy of data protection policy, and do it fairly significantly? The other is, what parts of privacy and data regulation should actually stay? What are the principles that should stay no matter how innovation takes place, right? And the other is your opinion on what you think laws like the GDPR and the Indian Data Protection Bill, whether they're actually tailored to account for business innovations, or do you think there are some parts that are actually going to hurt the way innovation occurs in the economy? So, and if Tarunima has some comments, we can hear those, or we can open it up to the audience for discussion.
No, Anirudh, no comments on my end. I see a lot of questions in the chat, so I'd like to jump right to it.
Sure. Do you want to start with the?
Oh,
with
sure,
the
sure.
questions?
I could just look at so the one that I mean, there's a long list, but I'll look at the one that was clearly on a point in the slide, which is how come India doesn't figure as a country for algorithmic training. So one thing to realize is that at this moment, this is something that might change. A lot of the algorithms are made open source by researchers and companies once they've developed them, but a lot of the innovation is in developing them first, right? And so when it comes to that innovation, India is not actually on the sort of rank, because and this is based on, again, like the number of machine learning papers that are published. And so if you think about the more recent machine learning AI developments, and the innovation in the algorithms, which are actually very important, because without these innovations and algorithms, we wouldn't have realized we need data in the first place, right? So all of those are actually coming from US and China, Europe, but India is not high on that list. So this is Surinder. If I answered your question, great. Otherwise, feel free to put another one in a follow-up in the chat window. Anirudh, do you want to maybe look at some of the other ones, and then we can alternate?
Yeah, sure. So there's been one question on the conditions under which data should be requested and shared, and how do Indian private enterprises typically use personal data? And I think the conditions are pretty straightforward, which is data cannot be collected or shared without your consent. And like I said, the Indian bill is still in Parliament. It's not law yet, but even under existing law, under the IT Act, there are rules that say data cannot be collected without your consent, and you have to be given notice of what all purposes the data is going to be used for. So that's the basic framework under which this entire data collection and processing market currently works. The other part is, how do Indian private enterprises typically use personal data? Well, it really depends from sector to sector. A health or a pharma company might use personal data in a completely different way than, say, a telecom company or a Flipkart or a Ola. So it's really context dependent on how they're going to use that data that they're collecting.
Yeah. So just to maybe plug, I mean, also because I looked at this in context of credit, so much of our data is being used to understand if we should be given loans, right? And this is all your cell phone data. It's being used to understand how much your insurance should be priced, how much should your loans be priced at. Yeah, in a lot of ways, you wouldn't expect data that you wouldn't expect to be used in a certain way. Does personal data gets used in all sorts of ways to rank and score people as well.
Yeah. There's another question on how departments within the government actually coordinate the role of different regulators to look at data and non-personal data. Well, the nodal agency within the government is the Ministry of Information Technology, which basically looks at information technology standards, what are the latest developments in data processing, data collection. It looks at it from an innovation perspective, but also from a security perspective. And there, it creates standards, but it also coordinates between different departments on how to actually look at some of these issues. And if we create a data protection authority, the nodal department again will be the Ministry of Information Technology.
Why would corporations share their data? I mean, so yes, like as such, they might not have incentives to share, but at the same time, we are seeing the rise of data trusts. So, for example, Uber has shared a lot of the data with the Netherlands Transportation Authority, because a lot of these corporations are now, affecting sort of public functions, right? So whether you look at Airbnb, where it has implications for housing tax and residential planning. Similarly, Uber has implications for transportation planning. And so in some one of the reasons corporations are sharing their data is because city and the national administrations are. The other reason is also often just, I guess PR, but sometimes people do genuinely, there are teams within companies that actually want to see data being used, in interesting ways. So, you have Google, Facebook, all of these companies will routinely use data sets, share data sets. Facebook has a data set on its estimation of populations of the world based on Facebook usage, right? And so those are the sort of data sets where it's also trying to say that, look, all the data we're collecting does so much good, so you should let us collect data. Anirudh, do you want to add on that?
No, I don't think I have anything to add to that. There was another question which I think I can take a stab at, and then maybe you can come into it. It's about having control over user data, and the question is, if there's a downside of not having control of our data, what would be the upside of gaining more control, and what value would there be to society if we had more control over how it was used? It's an interesting question, and I think the idea is that control over data is more about you having autonomy and control over how your information or how information about you is shared in the economy or is shared in society. So the value to society is that individual autonomy and individual responsibility for sharing information about them increases. The other claim which is often made out is that you are also then in charge of being able to economically benefit from the use of your data. And there, I think the jury is the idea is a little ambiguous, because it's not immediately clear whether you are the best person to understand how to benefit from the use of your data. But Tarunima, if you have something to add there.
Yeah, no, I think Anirudh, broadly what you said, but also that, this is actually a very deep question. And I mean, in some ways central to so many policy and like political and social debates around data at the moment. But like there is, I think if we are again putting data as even as both Anirudh and I are trying to complicate that narrative that data is central to everything that is happening in terms of data, the data economy. I think there is this idea that if you had control of your data, you'd have creative control. Like you'd have sovereignty, both national, individual, and then of course, as you said, you'd have economic gains as well. Yeah, I'll just pause at that.
There's another question which basically asks, how can we dismantle arbitrary barriers to cross-border data sharing by implementing backstops that provide assurance of appropriate safeguards to governments without undermining global growth? And what does a practical approach look like? How can countries ensure that they have appropriate policy frameworks in place to maximize benefit and minimize risk? So there's a lot packed into that question. To start off, I think the barriers to cross-border data sharing are basically coming from two objectives. One is this fairly legitimate concern by law enforcement officials that, look, data is being stored in a foreign country or in a different country, and Indian law enforcement agencies, for example, are unable to access it. And a lot of this is also because countries like the US, and one or two other countries actually prohibit uh, the sharing of personal data by their companies, even if that data is actually about a third country. Right? So there is a genuine conflict of legal systems or jurisdictions there. So it's a complicated situation that has to be resolved by countries either entering into agreements to resolve this issue and to give each other access to that data, or to actually go the other way, which is to say that, look, if a US company is operating in India, then it actually has to register as an Indian entity in India and hold all the data collected in India under its own control. Right? So then it's no longer a US entity, it's an Indian entity, and then it becomes subject only to the laws of India. Right? So there are two fairly extreme alternatives. And my preference would be to resolve it through international agreements and minimize the compliance cost for companies. But those are some of the approaches that are at play right now.
So there are a couple of questions that I actually want clarification on, and so maybe Shivani or any of the moderators could ask back. But this idea that if the benefits of democratic control over data can only be realized when members are present to build a critical mass, then how will users be incentivized to join in the early stages? So I want to maybe push back and say, ask where that assumption is coming from, which is that the benefits of democratic control can only be realized when members are present to build a critical mass. If there was something in our presentation that alluded to that, let us know and we can clarify. I'm not sure I fully agree with that statement, but Anirudh, if you want to take a stab at it, you should go ahead.
Yeah, actually, even I wanted a clarification if the person can just speak up and clarify what they meant.
You please raise your hand.
Or you can type your response in the chat box, either way.
In the meantime, I can take this. This one seems fairly short. Why, how, and to what extent could AI enter decision making in the boardroom? I think to a large extent, again, AI is general purpose. It's already there on your cell phones. It's already there in your voice assistant systems. So I would say, in some ways, it already has. But I think if you were referring specifically to the analytics that inform the decisions, I would say it depends on how sort of like risk loving a boardroom is, because there are already companies, for example, that will say that that are using AI to, let's say, look at the balance sheets or look at the annual filings of different companies to see if they were hiding something, if they how successful they will be. And so these entities already exist, and if there are some boardrooms that are excited about these and believe in these, they're already at least referring to some of this data.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's one last question in the context of COVID-19, and this is an interesting question. What they're saying is, we've seen in the context of COVID-19 cases mapping in an area. So I think this is about contact tracing and apps like Arogya Setu also. Community level or population level effects of data are becoming important. It doesn't matter if I am, as an individual, shared my data, policies will affect me based on what others have shared. The question is, should we have a larger or a different basis for governing data other than just a personal data view? Again, really good question, and again, a lot to unpack here. So maybe I'll just take a stab at it. And I think the premise is completely correct. I think, especially in circumstances like COVID-19 or epidemics, it's not just up to you on how the sharing of data in society impacts you, but this is also something that occurs in a number of other circumstances. If you are someone who is new to online activity, you will be shown ads that are based on someone who shares your basic demographic profile, right? Even if you have yourself not shared any data on a particular website yet. So this is occurring on a much larger scale. It's just that in circumstances like COVID-19, it becomes much more acute. You feel the brunt of it in a much larger or on a much more direct scale. Uh, so I think there is a larger basis for governing data rather than just personal data. And it's not just about individual privacy. I think there is a notion of saying, look, you cannot allow as a principle for certain firms to exercise this much control and this much power just by collecting data, because it is not just about a one-to-one relationship between the specific consumer and the company. It's also about how they're able to use that information from you to impact the behavior of others online. So I think even when we talk about personal data protection, we are not talking specifically on a one-to-one relationship. It is about how the data of individuals can actually be used to gain either market share or business advantages in society. Tarunima, do you have a different view on this?
No, I think the only not caveat. What I would want to add is that the non-personal data, proposal actually claims to be motivated by the same idea that because it's not they use this idea of like community data, right? And they talk about how data collected from, let's say, a farm or like a village is not really or let's say like this is land data, right? Like all of this is not about an individual, it is community data, community level data. And while that is the motivation, I think it still doesn't I think there is still like room to actually explore solutions that fully contend with this tension between the individual's data and the community data. So I just wanted to flag that I don't necessarily think that the approach that the non-personal data bill or like regulation that I proposed bill is tackles some of these issues that this question raises, even though it is motivated by very much the same concerns.
Right. I think there's a question that you can answer, which is why doesn't academia consider AI and machine learning interchangeable terms? Even I'm curious about this one.
Sorry, why doesn't academia
Consider AI and machine learning interchangeable?
Well, I mean, it's also because it's a very sort of like long arc. So AI was, a very if people have time for this, AI was a very like has a long history. When it came about in the 60s, the idea was that you are actually trying to give it's actually quite it's like a very famous story, but like someone in MIT thought it was going to be a summer project, right? And they were like, oh, this is Media Lab, the Marvin Minsky group, and they were like, we're going to build the system out in 3 months, right? And the idea, even if you think of what AI is doing right now, which is that you're literally feeding it data, and machine learning is doing right now, you're feeding it data, and it gives you sort of predicts future patterns based on past patterns. There's not when like till 10 years or 2009, right? So like about till 10 years back or 11 years back, it wasn't even fully clear that would work. So when I was working with my professor, he was very opposed to this idea of AI. So we used to spend a lot of time looking for like similarities or how humans would make decisions, or like how humans understand speech, and try and see if like machines can like capture those same patterns, which is very different from what is happening now, where it's like you throw past data and you like you sort of get future outputs, right? So in some ways you could say that the current machine learning model is very sort of Skinnerian. It's very like you just feed it a lot of data and then it like throws out output afterwards. But in some ways it hasn't like learned the inherent rules of how humans make decisions or learn or speak. Like it's not in that sense. So I would say machine learning is a very specific way of implementing certain features of AI, which is why if you're being very particular, you would not call machine learning and AI the same thing.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I think we covered it all. Anirudh.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. This was really great. We hope you had we hope you learned and understood and enjoyed this discussion. And a big thank you to Tarunima and my colleagues who are helping organize this. Thank you, everyone. Please enjoy the rest of the GTS.
Thanks, Anirudh, and thanks everyone else. Yeah. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye. So if anyone wants the PPT, I can email it to them at their registered email address. You can just email me at my email address. It's anirudh.burman@ceip.org, and I'll just email you the PPT. Thank you.
Hey, Anirudh.
Hey.
Yeah, all the attendees are out. So would you like to record your 60-second video?
Yeah. What am I supposed to do, and what am I supposed to say?
So, couple of questions for you. Okay. So, how did you think the session went?
Are you asking me, or I mean, is it for the video?
I'm asking you, and also, of course, this is what is supposed to go in the video. So, please talk about how you liked the session and if you thought it was interactive enough, if there were any new insights or any new ideas that you gained from the questions or from the participation that you got, or if there were any particularly interesting questions that you thought could be researched further.
Okay. I think the session went really well. I think Tarunima did a really great job of giving a broad overview of what are the trends that are taking place in the data innovation ecosystem right now. And I think the participants had very, very good questions, especially on things like localization, on the whole idea of private data and benefiting from more control over their own data. I think there were difficult and thought-provoking questions. I also really like the question on the whole idea of contact tracing and the way we should think about personal data policy in the context of your personal data being used for wider social ramifications and having broader consequences rather than just for you as a person. So I think they were very, very good questions. So on the whole, I think the interaction was pretty good.
Okay, thank you. I think it was a great session.
Okay. Are you speaking as part of the video, or is it?
No, video is only yours. I'm saying I think it was a really good session, and the questions were pretty. Some of them were quite technical, and I think I really like the question on the difference between AI and machine learning. That was very good.
Yeah, I
did
should
want-
have asked Tarunima before that. So, how many people did we have in the other sessions?
I don't know that yet. I will. I just marked attendance for us, and
Okay.
Shivangi, at what? Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, sir.
At what point do we stop the recording?
Now?
I think now. Yeah.
All right. Are you going to do it, or is you or some? All right, you do it.